The day our scouting vessel, the Vorath 9, dropped out of faster-than-light travel above the third planet of the Sol system, Commander Drexel Voon let out a sound that, if translated into human terms, would be described as a snort, a long, drawn-out, deeply condescending snort. "This," he announced to the bridge crew, sweeping one of his forearms toward the observation window, "is what High Command considers a potential threat." The planet below was, well, it was green and blue, which was admittedly pleasant to look at, but the sensor readings were, to put it politely, embarrassing on behalf of the species living there. The crew of the Vorath 9 stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the data scrolling across their screens. Then, almost in unison, they began to laugh. Not polite laughter, not the kind of laughter you do when someone makes a mediocre joke at a council dinner. This was full-bellied, shoulder-shaking, tears-forming in secondary eye ducts laughter, the kind that makes your spinal ridges ache. "Commander," said Lieutenant Prek Soravio, wiping moisture from his facial crest, "their most advanced projectile weapons. They use controlled chemical explosions to propel small metal objects at each other." "I know," Drexel said, grinning with all 3 rows of his teeth, "at speeds that our basic hull plating would just—" Prek could not finish the sentence. He dissolved into another wave of laughter, gripping the navigation console for support. "Would just tickle us," finished Weapons Officer Eula Dran, who was herself doubled over near the targeting station. And look, from their perspective, completely reasonable reaction. The Vorath Collective had been sailing between star systems for over 6,000 years. Their warships could punch holes through moons. Their personal armor could survive the surface temperature of a small star for approximately 40 seconds, which is 40 seconds longer than anything needed to survive that. They had energy weapons that could reduce a city block to superheated vapor in the time it took a human to blink. And here were these humans. These soft, squishy, entirely unarmored little bipeds, strutting around their single-occupied planet with what essentially amounted to very fast rocks. Drexel pulled up the intelligence file that High Command had flagged as concerning. He read it twice, then he read it a third time. Because surely he had missed something. He had not missed anything. "They call this one a 50 caliber rifle," he said slowly, pronouncing the human words with the careful disdain of someone handling a piece of rotting fruit. "The projectile weighs approximately 42 grams. It travels at roughly 900 meters per second." He paused. "Our standard infantry armor can sustain repeated direct hits from a weapon that fires plasma bolts at 60,000 meters per second. And High Command wants us to treat these people as a priority contact situation." "Perhaps High Command has lost their secondary minds," Prek offered helpfully. "Perhaps," Drexel agreed. "Still, orders were orders." The Vorath Collective had strict protocols about first contact with developing civilizations, and those protocols existed for boring bureaucratic reasons that Drexel had never fully bothered to understand. The short version was, you land, you make contact, you demonstrate superiority, you offer the locals a choice between integration and irrelevance, and then you file 17 forms in triplicate. Drexel had done this 11 times. It had never once been interesting. He did not expect this time to be any different. The landing site they chose was a flat stretch of open land in a region the humans called a military testing ground. This was, in retrospect, the first clue that something might not go entirely according to the script. But Drexel was not the kind of commander who read clues. He was the kind of commander who read sensor data, and sensor data said the area was large, flat, and had minimal civilian population nearby. Convenient, efficient, perfect. The Vorath landing party consisted of 12 soldiers in full combat armor, Drexel himself in his ceremonial command suit, which was admittedly slightly less armored than the combat suits but significantly more impressive looking, Prek as his aide, Eula as weapons observer, and a cultural translator named Brix Ovenu, who had studied humans for approximately 3 years and was considered something of an expert. "They will likely be afraid," Brix advised as the ramp descended. "Their historical records suggest they respond to perceived threats with aggression before retreating to negotiation. We should appear non-threatening initially." "Should I remove my command sash?" Drexel asked. "The sash is fine. Just do not show teeth. I always show teeth when I greet someone. It is polite. On this planet, showing that many teeth means you are about to eat someone." Drexel considered this. Their social customs are exhausting. He stepped off the ramp, did his best to arrange his face into something neutral, and came face to face with a line of human soldiers standing roughly 200 meters away. They were wearing dull-colored clothing. They were holding their chemical propellant projectile launchers. Several of them were pointing the launchers at Drexel and his crew. Standing slightly ahead of the human line was a single figure in different clothing. Not a soldier, or at least not dressed like one. A smaller human, with reddish hair and an expression that Brix would later describe as either extremely calm or extremely furious. The translator module cannot distinguish which. That one, Brix said quietly, appears to be their designated speaker. The human raised a small communication device and spoke into it. A translation played through the Vorath crew's earpieces a half-second later. My name is Delegate Ashamori. I represent the Unified Response Council of this planet. We are aware you are not from our star system. We would like to discuss the terms of your visit. Drexel blinked. Terms, he repeated. They want to discuss terms. Bold, Prex said, or delusional, Eula offered. Both, said Brix. Drexel took a step forward and activated his own translator. Greetings, Delegate Ashamori. I am Commander Drexel Voon of the Vorath Collective. We come with the formal intention of assessing your civilization for potential integration into the collective. You have been flagged as a developing species requiring guidance. He paused to let that land. Ashamori looked at him for a very long moment. Guidance, she said. Correct. You came here to guide us. Among other objectives, yes. Another long pause. Then, that is incredibly condescending. Drexel turned to Brix. Did she just? She called you condescending, yes. I heard what she said. I am asking you to tell me I heard it wrong. You heard it correctly. Drexel turned back to the delegate who had folded her arms and was watching him with the patient intensity of someone who had been in many meetings with insufferable people and had developed strategies for surviving them. Delegate Mori, he said carefully, I do not think you fully appreciate the technological disparity between our civilizations. We have assessed your weapons capability. Your military hardware is. He paused, searching for a diplomatic word. Quaint, she repeated, flat as a horizon line. I mean no offense. You mean enormous offense, but go ahead. Behind her the line of soldiers had not moved. They were still holding their rifles, still pointing them with that particular patient stillness that Drexel was beginning to find mildly unsettling. Not because he was afraid of the weapons, obviously, he absolutely was not, but because humans were supposed to be more visibly nervous than this. High Command's behavioral profile had said they would be nervous. The profile had been very specific about nervousness. These soldiers did not look nervous. They looked like they were waiting for something. Perhaps, Drexel said, deciding a demonstration was in order. A brief display would help clarify our respective positions. He nodded to Eula. Eula raised her plasma lance aimed at a large boulder approximately 300 meters to the left of the human line and fired. The boulder ceased to exist. In its place was a scorched circle of glass where the sand had been superheated and fused. The shockwave ruffled Delegate Mori's red hair. She looked at the glass circle. Then she looked back at Drexel. Impressive, she said. Thank you. Can I show you something? Drexel gestured graciously. By all means. Ashamori turned and said something to the soldier nearest her. That soldier jogged back toward the row of vehicles parked behind the human line, and a moment later a much larger vehicle rumbled forward. It was tracked, heavily plated, with a very long barrel mounted on top. That, Brix said carefully, is a tank. Their most powerful conventional ground weapon. The projectile it fires can penetrate approximately 800 millimeters of rolled steel at 1 kilometer range. Our armor is rated to withstand considerably more than that, Drexel said unconcerned. Yes, said Brix, I know. The tank stopped. Its barrel elevated slightly. Ashamori looked at Drexel and said, perfectly pleasantly, this is not the demonstration. Drexel frowned. Then what is? The ground shook. Not because the tank had fired. The tank had not fired. The ground shook because something much larger than a tank had just moved, somewhere to the north, and the low-frequency vibration of it traveled through the dirt and up through the soles of Drexel's boots and into his bones in a way that he did not enjoy at all. He looked north. There was a ridgeline approximately 2 kilometers away. He had noted it on the approach. Flat scrubland, some sparse vegetation, unremarkable. The ridgeline was moving. No, not moving. Rising. Because what he had identified as a ridgeline was not, as it turned out, a geological feature. It was a row of vehicles, massive ones, covered in camouflage netting that had blended them perfectly into the terrain. And as the netting was pulled back, sensor systems that had read clear 30 seconds ago were suddenly screaming at Drexel through his earpiece. Commander, Eula said, and her voice had changed. The laughter was entirely gone. Commander, I am reading thermal signatures consistent with active missile systems, multiple active missile systems, and those vehicles to the east, those are rail-mounted artillery platforms, and they appear to be Already aimed at us, Prek finished, barely whispering. When did they? Drexel stared. When did they position all of this? Before we landed, Brick said quietly. Commander. They knew we were coming before we landed. Ashimori cleared her throat. We have been tracking your vessel since it entered our outer solar system, she said, matter-of-factly. We had 11 days to prepare. We used them. She tilted her head slightly. Now, I said, this is not the demonstration. Do you want to see the demonstration? Drexel's mouth was open. He was not aware that his mouth was open. Prek quietly nudged him, and he closed it. These weapons, Drexel said, and his voice had the particular strained quality of a very confident person rapidly becoming a less confident person, will not penetrate our armor. Your explosive yields are insufficient to... Commander, Asha said, with the patience of someone explaining something to a person who has been specifically warned that they would need the explanation. I know what your armor can withstand. We have been collecting data on Vorath technology for 8 months, ever since your preliminary scout drone flew through our outer system and we quietly captured it. The silence that followed was very loud. You captured our scout drone, Drexel said. We were very polite about it. That drone was equipped with a self-termination protocol that should have activated upon unauthorized contact. Yes, it tried. It was very determined. Our engineers found it charming. She uncrossed her arms. We reverse-engineered approximately 40% of its systems before it finally managed to overload its own power cell. 40% was enough. Eula made a sound that was not quite a word. Enough for what? Drexel asked. Ashimori smiled. It did not look like a smile that meant she was about to eat him. It looked considerably worse than that. Enough to know exactly what frequencies will pass through your armor like it is not there, she said. And then we spent the last 8 months building weapons that operate on those frequencies. She paused. That is the demonstration. Behind her the tank's barrel had not moved, but on top of 3 of the other vehicles, strange cylindrical devices were now rotating slowly into position. They did not look like any weapon Drexel had encountered in 11 first contact missions. They looked almost modest, understated, the kind of device a person might overlook entirely because it did not look threatening enough. Drexel had a sudden strong feeling that he had made a significant error in judgment. Delegate Mori, he said. I would like to revisit the discussion of terms. She looked at him for a long moment, a very long moment. The kind of moment that has weight and texture and makes the air feel thick. I thought you might, she said. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in the moments after a very confident person realizes they have made a catastrophic miscalculation. Drexel Voon knew this silence well. He had watched other commanders experience it during his years rising through the ranks of the Vorath Collective. He had watched admirals go quiet at council tables when their strategies collapsed. He had watched fleet captains lose the ability to form sentences when their assumptions turned out to be wrong. He had never, not once in his entire career, expected to be standing in the middle of that silence himself. And yet, here he was. Boots planted on human soil, 4 arms hanging at his sides, staring at a row of unassuming cylindrical devices that were now humming with a frequency his suit sensors could not properly classify. The readout on his visor kept cycling through error messages, not because the devices were overloading his sensors, because his sensors had no category for what they were detecting. That was, objectively, worse. Bricks, Drexel said quietly without moving his mouth much. Yes, Commander. Brix Ovenu replied, equally quiet, equally still. You studied humans for 3 years. I did. Did your studies include any mention of them being terrifying? I was going to say resourceful. The answer to both questions, Brix said, is that I severely underestimated the scope of the relevant documentation. Prek Soravio, standing to Drexel's left, had not said anything for approximately 90 seconds. For Prek, who had an opinion about everything including the thermal regulation settings of the ship's lower deck corridors, this was unprecedented. He was staring at the cylindrical devices with the expression of someone doing very rapid and very unpleasant mathematics in their head. Eula Dran had her hand on her plasma lance. She had not raised it. She was smart enough to understand that raising it right now would be the last interesting decision she ever made. Delegate Asha Mori stood 20 meters away, hands clasped behind her back, watching Drexel with an expression of polite patience. Around her the human soldiers had still not moved. They did not fidget. They did not murmur to each other. They simply stood with their chemical propellant rifles and their dull-colored clothing and their complete absence of visible anxiety. And Drexel found himself revising his entire psychological profile of the species in real time. High Command's report had described humans as emotionally volatile, prone to panic under pressure, likely to fragment under displays of superior force. High Command, Drexel was beginning to understand, had written that report without ever actually meeting a human. You mentioned terms, Asha said pleasantly. Before the demonstration you used that word first actually. I just borrowed it back. Drexel straightened slightly. He was a commander of the Vorath Collective. He had his dignity to consider. I am willing to engage in a preliminary dialogue regarding the parameters of this interaction, yes. Good. That is excellent news. She gestured toward a low structure about 50 meters to the right of the main vehicle line. It had a flat roof, several chairs arranged around a table, and a large canopy providing shade from the afternoon sun. I had refreshments prepared. I assumed we would eventually get here. Prek made a strangled sound. She assumed. She prepared refreshments in advance of us asking for. Yes, Brix said tiredly. She did. That is either extremely optimistic or extremely calculating. Prek said. With humans, Brix replied. It is usually both simultaneously. The table was strange. Drexel had to admit that. He had attended first contact negotiations 11 times, and they had all taken place in sterile ship environments with formal seating arrangements and the full ceremonial weight of Vorath diplomatic protocol pressing down on every word. This was a folding table with mismatched chairs, and a tray of small food items that Brix identified as sandwiches, and something called coffee. Drexel sat. His 12 armored soldiers arranged themselves behind him in parade formation, which he had requested mostly because standing in parade formation was the only way he could guarantee they would not do something that escalated the situation. Eula sat to his right, Prek to his left. Brix took the seat at the end, closest to Asha's side of the table, which seemed appropriate. Asha sat across from Drexel. 2 of her own aides sat with her. One was a young man with close-cropped hair and the posture of someone who had spent considerable time in military service. The other was an older woman with gray streaks at her temples and a tablet device she consulted with the quiet focus of a person who had prepared very thoroughly for this exact moment. Let us begin with the obvious question, Drexel said. The weapons, Asha said. The weapons. She leaned back in her chair. 8 months ago when we recovered your scout drone, we found a materials analysis module in its sensor array. It was cataloging everything it encountered. Hull compositions, atmospheric samples, biological data, and, most usefully, it had already begun modeling Vorath standard armor based on the emission signatures of your soldiers during an earlier long-range pass over one of our northern military installations. It was conducting a passive survey, Drexel said carefully. It was mapping our weaknesses, Asha corrected, without any particular heat in her voice. Which is fine, that is what scouting does. But the module it was using to do that modeling, once we cracked the encryption, also contained the baseline parameters of your armor's frequency tolerance ranges. She paused and took a slow sip of her coffee. You essentially handed us your own vulnerability report. Drexel looked at Eula. Eula looked at the table. The devices you see on those vehicles, Asha continued, are what our engineers built using that data. We call them resonance disruptors, for lack of a better term. They generate a targeted oscillating field in the exact frequency bands your armor cannot filter. They do not explode. They do not burn. They simply pass through your armor entirely and interact directly with the organic material inside. Define interact, Drexel said. Extreme cellular disruption, she said simply. It would be very fast. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think honesty matters in a first conversation. We are not here to be cruel. We are here to be clear. The afternoon wind moved across the canopy above the table. Somewhere in the distance, one of the large artillery vehicles made a mechanical sound as it adjusted its position. Drexel sat very still. You built these weapons in 8 months, he said. We had good source material. You reverse-engineered Vorath sensor technology in 8 months. 40% of it, she said, holding up one finger. The other 60% we figured out independently once we had a direction to work in. We are quite good at working backward from a problem. Prek leaned close to Drexel's ear. Commander, he murmured. If High Command learns that their own scout drone provided the technical foundation for a weapon capable of killing Vorath soldiers, High Command will not learn that from me, Drexel said at a volume only Prek could hear, because I intend to still be alive when this conversation ends. He turned back to Asha. What do you want, delegate? She set down her cup. The casual looseness left her posture, not replaced by hostility, replaced by something more focused. Something that made the air around the table feel different. We want 3 things, she said. First, we want formal recognition from the Vorath Collective that this planet and its people are a sovereign civilization, not a developing species. not a contact candidate, not a guidance project, a sovereign civilization with all the rights and protections that designation carries under collective charter law. Drexel blinked. You know collective charter law? We have been monitoring collective communications frequencies for 6 months. Your encryption is very good. Our people are better. She did not say this with arrogance. She said it the same way someone states that water is wet. Second, we want access to collective star charts covering a radius of 500 light-years from our system. We are planning to expand. We would prefer to do so without accidentally wandering into someone else's territory. You are planning to expand, Drexel repeated. We have 17 active deep space propulsion programs currently in development. The fastest of the current prototypes has achieved approximately 12% of light speed in test runs. We estimate we will reach practical interstellar travel capability within 60 to 80 years. She paused. We would rather not spend those first decades having misunderstandings with neighbors. Drexel stared at her. 12% of light speed, with chemical and electromagnetic propulsion systems, and some novel approaches that our engineers came up with on their own, she said. They get creative when you give them a deadline and a reason. Eula had stopped looking at the table. She was now looking at Asha Mori with an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from contempt and arrived somewhere in the neighborhood of profound unease. You said 3 things, Drexel said. The third is simpler, Asha said. We want you to go home and tell High Command exactly what happened here. Every detail. The drone, the reverse engineering, the weapons, the readiness level they found when they arrived. All of it. Drexel frowned. That will not reflect well on this mission. No, she agreed. It will not. But it will reflect accurately on this species, and accurate information is what we need High Command to have. She folded her hands on the table. Because we are not looking for a war with the Vorath Collective. We are not looking for a war with anyone, but we are also not going to be guided, integrated, assessed, or managed. We are going to be neighbors, and we would very much prefer that everyone involved understands that clearly, before any more scout drones enter our solar system. The canopy above the table made a soft sound in the wind. Drexel looked at the cylindrical devices on the vehicles. He looked at the soldiers who had not fidgeted once in the entire time he had been standing on this planet. He looked at Asha Mori, who had prepared refreshments for a negotiation she had been confident would happen before he was confident it would happen. He thought about 11 first contact missions, about civilizations that had cowered, or raged, or begged, or tried to fight with the panicked energy of people who knew they were outmatched and were fighting anyway. None of them had done this. None of them had spent 8 months quietly turning a Vorath scout drone into a blueprint for a weapon capable of bypassing Vorath armor, stationed that weapon across a prepared kill zone, arranged a diplomatic delegate with the composure of someone who negotiates for sport, and then offered sandwiches. Drexel said. Yes, Commander. In your 3 years of study, did any of the source material describe humans as patient? Brix thought about it. One text described them as the only known species that responds to existential threat by immediately beginning to work on solutions rather than panic responses. The author considered it their most defining characteristic. What species was the author? Human, Brix admitted. So they wrote that about themselves. Yes. And having met them, Drexel said slowly, do you believe they were wrong? Brix looked at the resonance disruptors, at the artillery, at the soldiers, at Asha Mori, who was quietly refilling her coffee and waiting with the enormous patience of a species that had looked up at the stars for thousands of years and spent that time not just wondering what was out there but getting ready for it. No, Brix said. I do not believe they were wrong at all. Drexel turned back to the delegate. Your 3 terms are acceptable in principle. I will need to relay them to High Command through formal channels, which will require, we know the process, Asha said. We have read the charter. Take the time you need. We are not going anywhere. A pause. Well, not yet. That last part was said very quietly, almost to herself. But Drexel heard it, and something about the way she said it, with that particular mix of patience and absolute forward momentum, stayed with him long after the Vorath 9 had lifted from the surface and turned its nose toward the stars. He filed his report to High Command 6 hours later. Every detail, as requested. The drone, the reverse engineering, the resonance disruptors, the readiness level, the negotiation, the sandwiches. High Command's response took 4 hours to arrive, which was unusually fast. It contained 3 words: reassess, all, profiles. Drexel sat in his command chair and looked out at the stars, and thought about the small blue-green planet shrinking behind them, full of soft creatures with chemical propellant weapons and 60 to 80 years left before they reached the stars themselves. He thought about what they would bring with them when they arrived. He thought about the researcher who had written that humans respond to existential threat by immediately beginning to work on solutions. Then he quietly opened a new file and began drafting a personal recommendation to High Command. It was 3 pages long. The summary, however, was one sentence. When they come, and they will come, make sure they are coming as friends.